Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I'm going to be talking about an area of history, a historical time period that I'm very interested in, but also a related problem to historical, what we call historical methodology in general. And not really, I can't really call this a historical fallacy, but some dangers in historical thinking to keep an eye out for that might be helpful and applicable to other areas. So, what I want to talk about is, of course, the scientific revolution. Now, let me start off by asking, and this is, of course, rhetorical, but I guess feel free to post your response in the comments section. When you think of the scientific revolution, what do you think of? Now, when I ask this in class, most people will say something along the lines of Galileo or Isaac Newton. They'll talk about the development and the beginning of science. More astute students, maybe, will talk about Copernicus or the heliocentric model, but usually we think of physics, astronomy, and someone like Newton. And the time period that we usually go back to is like 15th, 16th century. And if I asked you where the scientific revolution occurred, you'd most likely say Europe. And this is the entire reason why I want to talk about this. So when I teach history, I have to teach, for example, it's divided up into World History 1 and World History 2. And I always tell people like this is an impossible task because, for example, consider World History One. When does World History One start? Well, history is the history of humanity. So, history, some people will start it with written history, but I like to start it with the beginning of human beings some 300,000 years ago. So, in a 3 to 4 month class for World History One, I have to cover 300,000 years of human history. It's an impossible task, right? So, in order to help us navigate these vast time periods, and the same is true for world history too, we we give designators to certain historical periods. So, for example, we talk about you've heard of like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient China, ancient Egypt. We use the designator ancient to refer to a specific time period that we're talking about. We even do this with modern history. We'll talk about, for example, the Industrial Revolution or World War One or World War Two, although those are slightly different, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we talk about things like globalism or the global economy, or we might talk about something like the atomic age or the information age, something along those lines. I say all that to say we use these labels to generalize about certain periods of time, and one of those labels, of course, that I'm going to be talking about today is the scientific revolution, and whether the label scientific revolution is appropriate or whether it's can be misleading. And as you can imagine, this has generated a lot of discussion amongst historians of science. And the reason why I want to talk about this for me personally is it kind of combines to the two areas that I'm interested in, history on the one hand and philosophy on the other, the history of science specifically. So let's jump into it. So there's a very prominent historian of science, Stephen Shopin. I'm not sure if I pronounced that last name correctly. I read your book, Stephen. If you watch this, if that can be like a form of apology. I just don't know how to pronounce your name. This is a book I read back in grad school when I took a methodology course. I chose to read the book, but what always stuck out to me is that this is how the book starts. There was the book, of course, titled The Scientific Revolution, and the book starts, there was no such thing as the scientific revolution, and this is a book about it. Fantastic way to start an academic book, I think. Very intriguing, of course. But one of the things you talk about in a historical methodology class is how historians write history, how historians do history as a craft, how we investigate history, the methods through which we investigate history. On a surface level, those methods are pretty straightforward. We look at historical documents, we analyze historical archaeological places. In the case of modern history, if we're talking about the modern history of science, it's very, at least the area of history I do, is very text heavy. We're reading primary sources and analyzing the various influences on those sources. We're not necessarily focused on the more material aspect of history. But when you're focusing on more intellectual history, one of the big problems, questions related to methodology that you're faced with is whether or not the labels that you are inventing actually are applicable to the area that we're talking about. And this is the question, of course, that Stephen's raising by phrasing it in this way. When I ask, was there a scientific revolution? I'm not talking about some conspiracy theory. I'm not suggesting that Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, that all these people didn't exist and that it's made up. Rather, what we're asking is we have these preconceived images of what the scientific revolution means, what it entailed for the people who lived through that period. Is that label applicable? And of course, Stephen's going to suggest that a lot of this is assumptions that we're bringing to the table, and what we think of as the scientific revolution, what we think of as the start of science, the beginning of modern physics, the beginning of universities as institutions across Europe, the beginning of a whole host of things. That all of that is a little perhaps sensationalized. So why do historians make such claims that there was no scientific revolution, or that the phrase itself is misleading? Well, first and foremost is language. What does this phrase scientific revolution do? And like I said, this gets to the problem of labels. One of the ways I like to explain this to a class, if I'm teaching, especially if I'm teaching high schoolers, no one likes to be labeled. No one likes to be put in a box, especially teenagers. But the phrase teenager is a label, and the reason why teenagers especially don't like to be labeled, because they feel like the labels don't encapsulate, don't fully explain who they are as people, especially when we use those labels to dismiss them. Especially when we say, for example, to a teenager who is upset with us, oh, you're just going through puberty, or oh, it's just, it's just that age, you'll eventually grow out of it, it's not really that bad, right? We use these labels to dismiss what they're actively experiencing. And the danger here is that we run the risk, at least, of doing something similar when we stick very concretely to these historical labels that we use. And that's why the language here is so important. So let's go ahead and break this down. So let's start off with some of these assumptions. So the scientific revolution. When I use the label scientific, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Science. What do you think of when you think of science? Maybe you think of truth. Maybe you think of certainty. Maybe you think of the scientific method, the process and the method of discovering, of learning about, of nature revealing itself to us. All of these very grand, lofty ideas. So we think of something relating to the development of the scientific method, maybe, or the development of science as a discipline. And so when we say the scientific revolution, a lot of people's assumption there is that science, that scientific method, that science as an institution, that we're talking about its starting point. Well, the big question here is, well, did science start in 15th century Europe? Because again, the scientific revolution is talking about the birth of science in 15th century Europe. Well, the short answer to that question, to channel my inner pedantic philosopher, is this hinges entirely upon how you're defining science. What do you mean by science? And here's the thing about philosophy. Philosophy has a tendency to complicate ideas and concepts. And one of the things that the philosophy of science has revealed to us is that science is hard to understand. Science is hard to define, and it's actually really, really difficult to say precisely what science is. I have a video on my channel talking about the philosophy of science, and one of the major problems of the philosophy of science, especially in the 20th century, was the problem of demarcation. How do we distinguish science from pseudoscience? And part of that act of distinguishing, I'm confusing myself. Part of the act of distinguishing science from pseudoscience was coming up with a solid definition of science. And this proved incredibly difficult. You can go watch the videos. Some of the greatest philosophers of science of the 20th century attempt to solve the problem of demarcation. Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, for example, are the two biggies. And yeah, it's a difficult undertaking. So to begin with, it's almost impossible. It's almost impossible to distinguish science from other forms of inquiry and other methods of knowledge. So, is this the birth of science? Well, this assumes that people prior to 15th century Europe were not doing science. That's an assumption that I think historically is not well founded at all. You can point to many ancient cultures and point to various scientific institutions that they have. And this also supposes that the disciplines and areas of study, for example, it gets very difficult to parse out the difference between astronomy on the one hand and astrology on the other. Now, nowadays, most people would not consider astrology a science, but that wasn't really the case in the ancient world. In fact, there was really no separation between astronomy and astrology, and almost every single ancient culture had some form of both. So, astronomy didn't start in 15th century Europe. So, and given that most people are judging what is scientific either by astronomy or physics, because we're starting it with Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, well, then we can't really say that science started in 15th century Europe. You kind of see where I'm going there. And I have various other videos on that if you're interested. But let's go ahead and move on to the second word, revolution. So, like science, let's do some word association here. When I use the word revolution, what comes to mind? What do you think of? Now, for most people, when they think of revolution, they're going to think of something political, a political revolution. And I think that there's good reason for that. So, going back to those, how we divide up history into historical time periods, we have the scientific revolution. Following shortly after the scientific revolution, we have what we title the Enlightenment. And a major characteristic, a major feature of the Enlightenment were some very major political revolutions: the English Revolution, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution, followed, of course, by the Industrial Revolution, which was not overtly political, but carried very serious political connotations. But different story for a different day. So let's look at the American Revolution. So when we think of a revolution, we can ask, well, what do revolutions do? What is the result of a revolution? And generally speaking, as is the case with the American Revolution, what the result is the replacement of one form of government or the replacement of one group of people who are in power with another form of government or with another group of people. And in cases like the American Revolution, this is pretty easily identifiable. We can talk about the causes of the American Revolution. And of course, there's going to be some wiggle room there in terms of which cause one historian thinks is more important, or which cause is more prominent or played a big role. And different historians might start the conversation about when the American Revolution started or what was the principal driving force. of the American Revolution. Economic historians may focus on the practice of English colonialism. Military historians may want to emphasize the impact of the French and Indian War. More intellectual slash political historians may want to talk about the origins of Enlightenment thought in John Locke's treatise on government. I mean, there's a bunch of different places you can go to, but there's not really going to be a whole lot of disagreement about these causes. There might be disagreement about the importance or impact of specific causes, but there's a pretty clear starting point, especially when it comes to terms of the physical actions that took place with the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party leading up to the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. And of course, there's a definitive end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And the result, the outcome is also very clear: the overthrow of the British government and the establishment of the new colonial, the new American, I should say, the new American government. The question is, well, are we looking at a similar revolution with the scientific revolution? Now, of course, with the scientific revolution, we're not overtly talking about politics in the terms of replacing of one government with another, but you could make the argument that we're talking about the replacement of worldviews with one worldview to another. And there certainly are some similarities there. So we could talk about the replacing of the Ptolemaic, the geocentric model of the universe with the Copernican or the heliocentric model of the universe. But when you're talking about intellectual influence and intellectual replacement, this is where it starts to get complicated, because when it's difficult to pinpoint, it's difficult to pin down, because we can say that Copernicus developed the most popular heliocentric model in 15th century Europe, but when did people actually start to accept the Copernican model? Well, a couple of decades after Copernicus, you get Galileo, who's arguing for the Copernican model, but it's still not super popular until you get Kepler, and then kind of it's solidified by Newton. So it's not an overnight thing. It's not an immediate transition. One of the things that Thomas Kuhn explains is that the replacement of one scientific paradigm by another usually takes generations. It takes multiple decades. And in some cases, there's not really a clear transition. Probably the most famous example of this is Darwinian evolution. Darwin published his Origins of the Species in 1865 ish. I could be wrong about that date. Double check me. But famously, still, in terms of the last poll that I saw, 45-50% of Americans still don't accept the Darwinian revolution. So, was there a revolution if half of the people still don't accept it? It's not as dramatic with the Copernican revolution, largely because everyday people were not involved in the Copernican revolution as they were in the Darwinian revolution, for a whole host of historical reasons that are well beyond the scope of this video: the rise of literacy rates, the rise of public education, a whole bunch of really good stuff. But kind of related to that point, there were very few people comparatively speaking that were involved in the Copernican revolution. You're talking about a highly technical work that was only really accessible to a handful of people throughout Europe. All right, so why does any of this matter? Well, to begin with, labels matter, and how people use labels matter. I can't count how many videos I've made on my page so far talking about the ways in which this label of the scientific revolution has been misused. But yes, people can build faulty arguments based purely off of labels without actually analyzing the historical data. On top of that, these labels can be used to exclude, to minimize, and to put certain groups of peoples, in this case, I think, out of the conversation. This is also important because it also highlights the need when studying history to look at history in all of its complexity, to look at it in all of its messiness, and to ensure that the labels that we're using to describe a historical time period don't get rid of that messiness. We want the messiness, we want the chaos, and we want to analyze all the different aspects and all the different data and text and sites and all that other good stuff to ensure that we are not applying our own biases to these interpretations of history. All right. Well, I want to keep it relatively short. Let me know what you think in terms of whether you think the label, the scientific revolution, is accurate. Perhaps what are some other areas you think are mislabeled. I look forward to chatting with you all. And until next time.